All right, so starting where we left off, we had applied our first draft of our label to our bottle by UV mapping the center polygons along the outside of the bottle. And so right now, it doesn't look like a bottle. I mean, it's shaped like a bottle, but it's not glass, and it just looks like there's kind of a sticker on the outside here. So what we're going to do is, in our bottle label material, right now it's applying our texture. If you can kind of see this, it's applying our texture of the label over white, which means it's covering the rest of the bottle in white, which we don't want to do because we want glass to cover the rest of the bottle. So to cut out where we want our label to go, we want to enable the alpha channel in the material. So this isn't the alpha channel in the render. In the render settings, we're not here. We're in the alpha of the material. So in the texture slot, just like we've done a whole bunch of times before, we should be able to plug in our same texture map into the alpha channel, but you'll see that it is kind of done the opposite of what I want. It has made it reversed, so we can type, or we can check the invert. You may or may not have to check invert, but it's right there. And so now what we can see is, I'm actually going to, because this is like pretty blurry and not too great of a preview, I can increase the resolution that the viewport uses by going to editor, and then on texture preview size I can raise this to 2048 by 2048, which is what the size texture we're using. So just those two numbers will be equal. And so we see that we've got my label, my illustration, and it's over the checkerboard, which is, the checkerboard was what we were using when we were UV mapping. And if you see here, the texture tags on my object, remember back from the desk assignment, the tags work from left to right, meaning this checker tag being on the left means that it's the bottom layer, and then the label material being on the right means it's above. So what we can do to make this a label on top of glass is to make a glass material and put that glass material underneath the label. So I'll delete this checker tag, and that just kind of made my bottle turn invisible temporarily. So I'm just going to call this bottle glass, and this is just a blank white material for the time being, but what I can do to make it glass is I can enable the transparency checkmark channel, and so you'll see that the little shader preview thing kind of turned into sort of a ghost kind of looking thing. It's pretty hard to see, but in our viewport this looks kind of something like see-through, kind of glass-ish, roughly in appearance. But if I render this, if I turn off soloing so I can see the rest of my scene, so with my two bottles here, if I render, this doesn't exactly look like glass. So just checking on the transparency tab isn't enough. There's actually one super important value that we need to alter, and that is this one right here called refraction. And so most of you guys are probably familiar with what the word reflection means. So a reflection, in this case, if I sketch out on the board, so if we've got our sun or some sort of light source, and then we've we've got an object, so just a ball kind of on the ground. Some kind of shadowing over here because the light's coming down this way. So a reflection is a light ray that bounces off an object, somewhat self-explanatory. So this comes this way, and then it bounces off. So it bounces off at an angle, kind of like a billiard ball, how billiard balls bounce around on a table. They bounce off on equal direction. But what refractions are, if you don't know, is a refraction is a ray that goes into an object or goes through an object. So there's a couple things to note here about what is actually going on in 3D. And if I jump to Google, hopefully we can find a quick visual example. Oops. So, all right, this is a pretty good image. So reflections are rays that bounce off, and refractions are rays that go into an object. And you see how this kind of follows a path, and then as it's in the object, it kind of changes direction. If you think of a crystal ball, for example, that has a certain way that it looks like it reflects stuff, and our bottle refracts, or I'm sorry, a crystal ball refracts light one way, whereas our bottle or some sort of glass object refracts an object or refracts the light differently. And what this kind of bending number is, or what it's controlled by, is this button right here called refraction, and that's kind of a long-winded example, long-winded explanation, but I guess the definition word is called index of refraction, and what that is the angle that bends. So if you imagine, think of like looking down into a swimming pool, and you see like how the lights kind of like bounces around and everything looks all like wavy and stuff. Water has a refraction value of 1.3 or 1.333 repeating or something. Glass, on the other hand, has a value of 1.5. So if we type in 1.5, now that's not like an exact number. Obviously different kinds of glass or different objects can have slightly varying values, but if I punch in 1.5 here, we'll see that this looks a lot different. So I'm actually going to, that is too big. So the first thing you'll notice is once you start rendering glass is it's going to get a lot slower. The time that it takes to render stuff is going to go up exponentially in comparison to your previous scenes, because each of these little bounces here on our refraction, the computer has to calculate each kind of intersection, each bounce this light has to, or this ray of light has to go through. And so especially once I've got glass that overlaps each other, that's definitely going to slow down a lot. And so how I said that this value of refraction, it can be slightly different. I don't want to necessarily say thicker glass has a higher value, but harder glass has a higher value. Something like a plate glass window might be 1.56. Something like a delicate or brittle piece of plexiglass might be 1.4 4 or 5 or something. So if you kind of stop and think of what your object feels like if you're replicating a real product, like some sort of beverage bottle or whatever, if you try to examine kind of in your head what that material is going to be like, because if I just make a small change from 1.5 to 1.55 and re-render this, you'll notice you'll notice there is a difference, and so kind of nailing that value, getting that value correct for that index of refraction is going to be pretty important to making your glass look believable. 1.5 is a good starting value, but like I said, if you have kind of a harder or thicker kind of glass, you might want to raise that value slightly, a couple tenths of a point. And if you have maybe a thinner or a weaker sort of glass, you might want to lower it by a couple tenths of a point. And so I didn't render this too big. I rendered this actually a lot smaller resolution than is required. But if I zoom in, I can kind of see that it's subtle, but I can definitely spot the differences in the way that this light is kind of bending. And the larger the resolution, you'll be able to see more of this detail. Like if I were to render this at the proper size, which is 8 times larger than this, 6 times? Yeah, 6 times larger than this, I'll really be able to zoom in and spot these differences. So I would encourage you to start with a value of 1.5 and change it. Try 1.55, 1.45, 1.52 maybe.
Did you do anything to the color or reflectance?
No, not yet. All I've done so far is just change the refraction. And another thing to note is I kind of have said this before, that like nothing in real life is perfect. It would be very rare for a value to be like 0% or all the way up to 100%. So this blurriness value, what I want to say is, it would be basically impossible for this to be actually 0. So I might try like 2% and just see what that looks like, why this kind of renders. And then the next thing, our next step will be going into the reflectance. But again, kind of all these different tweaks and additions you make to your render are going to slow down kind of how fast this goes.
Did you make those changes on the same thing as your label, the same material?
No, so at this point I've got 2 materials.
Okay.
I've got my label material, which has an alpha. Oops. So I haven't touched the material for my label yet. I'm just working on my glass currently. If you have an object that is kind of like frosted glass, or is maybe chilled and it's got kind of like a little bit of condensation on it possibly, the blurriness value in your transparency will be super important for you to try to dial in. So again, I'll just kind of zoom in on this, and so this is 0% blurriness, and this is 2% blurriness, so that's maybe a little bit too high because it's kind of changing the way the inside of this works. So maybe I'll turn that back down to 1%. And I know this is going to seem kind of tedious, but changing a value and then re-rendering is an important part of look development, kind of dialing in your scene and all the settings and stuff exactly how you want or how your client wants. This is kind of a necessary evil in the process. pretty tedious. And sometimes it's good to take notes. If you make multiple changes at once, you might want to just sketch down like reflection 50%, blurriness 2%, and then do a render, and then on the next render maybe you'll try reflection 25%, like have one value double the other value and just kind of write notes down and keep track of it, because you might like something kind of in the middle. So it's looking pretty good for the time being. So I'm going to move on to the reflectance channel. So in our reflectance channel, we now have a transparency layer. And on this transparency layer, I'm going to want to raise the roughness on this one a little bit, because this wouldn't have a perfectly kind of mirror-like finish. And then, can I do it in color? Not sure. So most beer bottles are darker, or a darker brown. There's actually kind of a reason for that. It helps kind of preserve the freshness, because beer is sensitive to sunlight, and so I'm going to want to tint this brown, and I'm not sure. Not sure if I should do it in the color or in transparency. I guess we'll see.
Transparency.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to uncheck my color channel on the glass material, and on this transparency channel I'm going to add in a little bit of brown.
That looks very black.
Yeah, so it's not going to look too accurate in the viewport, chances are. Nope. So you just kind of have to guess and render. Alright, so too much.
I mean, your choices there look very black too.
So if you have a colored type of glass, it's going to be kind of tedious, but eventually you'll be able to dial in what color you should make it. So that's got a little bit too much color to it, but I like how transparent it's becoming. Because this is altering these shadows quite a lot now. As the light is coming through these bottles, it's picking up a lot of the color of the object it's going through, and it's casting a lot of red in these shadows. So I'm going to pull the saturation down, and if you're curious about any value, and I do this like honestly every day, I right click something and I click show help, and I will read the documentation. So it looks like absorption color might be a better nope. Looks like absorption color might be a better
Place to choose your color.
yeah. Nope. don't know. There used to be a recent color, like little slot thing.
I think you have to actually select OK for it to apply the color you just choose.
Yeah. So now let's try to darken this up a bit. It's kind of trial and error.
That looks like clear glass.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to our color set to white for each object.
I think you need a mix of both. Because those green and blue ones there, they look like slightly tinted green and blue, but they don't look like the glass itself is.
Yeah. Yep, so that didn't do much. So we'll probably have to use both. So it might be the absorption distance. So let me, okay. So my scene here, so I just made a default sized cube, and the default sized cube is 200 centimeters by 200 by 200 in each direction. And so if my bottle is like almost the size of a cube in terms of its width, its radius. And so that means, where'd that go? So this absorption distance of being 100 centimeters, this being nearly half the width of my bottle, I probably need to lower it, because what this absorption distance should mimic is effectively how thick your glass should be. So I might want to go to my top camera, and if I look at my bottle, if I make this maybe 5 by 5 by 5, so I know on my bottle, oops, this one over here, if I select this ring and this ring, I'll show you. So I just selected the same two pieces of geometry on the outside and the inside. Oops, this camera. So you can see basically what's selected up here. So now if I move this cube, where did you go? Yes, this cube. So with this bottle selected, go back to polygon mode. So if this box is 5, then I might want to try 8. That looks pretty close. So with my scene, just and everyone's scene scale is going to be a little bit different. I want to show you this kind of this troubleshooting step to take. So it looks like to me a value of 8 for how thick I want my glass to be looks like it might do pretty well. So by changing that, by changing this from 100 to 8, we can see that this is having quite an effect on our transparency. So if we render, oops, I need to go in my camera to render. Now this is looking pretty accurate, at least a lot more than it was before, with how it is color tinting the shadows. It's giving them a bit of a brown color, and it's making it relatively hard to see through clearly to the other side. You should be able to see through it, but not as if there's nothing there. So the next thing that's kind of troublesome is this specular reflection. Glass has a much smaller and more defined specular shape, whereas this is pretty broad. This almost looks like it might be made out of plastic or clay, perhaps. So I will jump into my reflectance channel, and on my specular, so yeah, I've got my default sized specular, which I am going to want to shrink the width. I'll try something like 20. And you'll see here it's already having an effect on my kind of shader preview. So we'll try like 20, increase the fall off, just, oops, negatively affect the fall off just a little. And now, let's render. So once you start working with transparent objects, the specular channel becomes even more important than it has been in the past, because on each layer of this glass, if you think, I'm looking through, your first guess would probably be 2 layers of glass, but really it's 4 layers, and I will illustrate why I'm saying that. But really, there's a whole nother layer in here. And so this light ray for my light is actually going through 1 intersection, 2 intersections, 3, 4, and then it's going out. So that specular value has an effect on each one of those hits. So dialing that number in as well becomes an even more important task. So this isn't exactly right. It's a little bit closer, maybe, but I might need to now bring this strength up a bit, and maybe not make it quite so thin. Yeah, it's already starting to look a little bit better. So I think the last thing I'll need to add to my glass material is going to be a slight reflection. So I'm going to add a Beckman reflection layer, and I'll call this reflection there. And I'm going to pull this down a bit, I think. Wait, no, set that to add. And let's just see what this looks like on its default settings. Because I should be seeing a little bit more of the presence of the other objects in the reflection of this bottle, I think. like it's doing much on the default setting. Tricky to work with this smaller screen.
I can see the can and the surface reflected.
So let's, I think I have to switch this to additive. I haven't worked with this reflection or with this transparency in quite some time, so bear with me. Yeah, mine's starting to do that now. It's kind of pulling away from the highlight a little bit. So I might just nix this and move on, possibly. It's actually kind of just dulling my reflection now. Again, we can always show help. So average should be the one that it's on. You know, it's like totally pulling off my specular. Interesting. Alright, we're gonna uncheck the reflection eyeball layer, and we'll revisit this, I think, down the road. So it's gonna save. And we'll move on to the next stage of lighting. So one thing that I haven't shown you guys yet is there are ways in the program to put an environment kind of around your scene that you necessarily don't have to see, but it will interact with reflections and lighting and stuff. And I think it'll help some of you guys if you've added in some sort of object and you're expecting it to look reflective, but it just looks black. If I've kind of walked you through or given you the little spiel about something reflective needs stuff to reflect. It's about positioning your lights correctly and giving that object something to you know, bounce reflective rays off of. This will probably help you out quite a bit, this next step. So one thing is I'm going to save before I open the content browser, because the content browser sometimes is a little finicky on these machines. Yeah, it just froze up. GR. So how I was just describing, having some sort of surrounding kind of environment around your scene, what you can do is in the content browser, if you type in HDR, just those three letters, HDR, and you hit enter, you'll hopefully wind up with a search page. And if you don't like the list view, you can go to view as icons or view as list, whatever you'd like. But I like the icons, and you can make the icons smaller or bigger. And for this purpose, I like the big one because I like to kind of get an idea. So what these are kind of confusing when you first look at them. If I open this up and open this up, this is the inside of a room, but it looks all like distorted and it kind of looks like a funhouse mirror. What this is it's called an HDRI, so that is a high dynamic range image. And what you can do is you can surround your scene with an image like this, and so in this case it looks like this is maybe like a bedroom or kind of like a weird looking hotel room or something. I could put this image, for example, around my scene and have this light here and this door and the floor and stuff reflect kind of off my objects. And I'm kind of thinking maybe some sort of like kitchen scene or maybe like a warehouse for my scene, because it's kind of like a craft brew. So something that maybe feels like a restaurant or where the beer is made or served, in my head kind of makes sense for what I would want to surround my scene with. So I'm going to scroll through this list and see if anything kind of makes sense. There's a lot of outside looking stuff, which isn't exactly the most useful. In our case, I think a lot of you guys are gonna want something that looks like a studio scene, or maybe like a light room or a stage. So there are some kind of towards the bottom that fit that bill. This one right here almost kind of looks like the stage we've set up, where you've got kind of this drop cloth background, and there's two lights on the side and one big one over here. This is almost kind of like a 3-point light in and of itself. So let's find one. This one looks kind of cool. I'll see what this looks like. This has got like a wooden kind of handcrafted sort of vibe to it. So let's put this one to use. So I'm going to shrink my content browser and not lose this one. Okay. So to get this on an object around my scene, what I need to do is make a new material, and I'm going to uncheck all the stuff that's checked by default, and I'm going to check luminance. And what the luminance channel does, kind of self-explanatory, is it is a way for it to emit light. So I'm going to drag this image from the content browser to my onto the texture slot in my luminance channel, and hopefully this is all good. If you guys are taking your files home, and if you have the student version, I don't believe the student version comes with content browser items. So what you'll actually want to do is you want to double click this, yes, to load it into the picture viewer, and then you're going to want to save this as a file and save this to your computer. Because if you go home, if you don't have a content browser because you have the student version at home through the school, then you'll go home and you won't have this image. You know, the program won't be able to pull this image from something that doesn't exist on your computer at home. So you'll want to click Save As and save this to your hard drive and go from there. So I'll shut up and apply this to an object. So the object we want to use to apply this to our scene is actually the sky object. So I'm going to make a sky object, and I'm going to name this environment, and I'm going to apply this material to my environment sky object. And let's just click render and see what this looks like. So you can find more HDRs on the internet pretty easily, much just like looking up reference images. Free HDR maps. You can Google something like free HDRI maps or environment, or so I'm going to try interior because I'm looking for some sort of interior scene. And I'm going to do my normal Google image thing. I'm going to turn on show sizes and turn on large. Not sure what that is.
Looks like a mall.
This is like a living room. Sweet. So this is a pretty cool like warehouse kind of thing. None of these are really
Workshoppy.
yeah, none of these are really kind of getting me too excited, but if you were going for kind of a light studio environment, this one, for example, would be pretty sweet to try out, or even this one in the related images. Let's close this up, and so let's look at what this is kind of doing now. So it's definitely doing a lot to my glass. It's not going to do much to my cans yet because my cans don't have any sort of reflection or refraction material, but it's definitely doing something to my bottle. It's adding a little bit more visual interest to my bottles. These kind of light streaks are they don't look great because the anti-aliasing isn't too high, but it's just adding a little something to the scene. And I can actually, if I jump out of my camera, I can kind of see the sky object kind of surrounding me, and I might actually kind of rotate this a little bit, because on my picture viewer I'm not quite liking how close all these kind of window panes are. If I kind of look back out in my scene, or like if I look out in the direction that the bottles are facing, you see these couple illuminated doorways. I'm not quite liking what those are doing to my render. So I'm going to take my environment object and rotate it. Rotate those lit up doorways kind of out of the way. And I might actually try to align this with this doorway over here. So let's jump back in our camera and render this, see what this looks like.
Why'd you pick sky instead of environment?
Because I believe you manipulate them a little bit differently. I've just always used sky. Let's see if there's a visual difference in the viewport. Right, so the environment, the quote-unquote environment one, you don't see. And so in rotating it, right, that's why. So rotating this quote-unquote sky object, since I can see it, I get a better, kind of more useful way to manipulate and to make changes to it. So that's why I use the sky. So over here back to our render. So this moved those door panels kind of off to the side, but they're still kind of visible. And now I'm getting this light over here on the right hand side of the bottle, which is kind of cool. I'm creating a little bit of visual interest by having a light source kind of on each side of my object. That's causing or making some interesting interaction in my scene. Controlling lights and controlling your reflections is a super important part of product development, product renderings. Because much like how in graphic design, if you're doing some sort of type or typography, you want to control your viewer's eye, there's kind of a hierarchy of information, you know, using different weights and stuff, you can kind of really control your viewer. And although it's kind of subtle, you don't really realize you're being influenced by these sorts of factors. But when you look at a render, or you look at some sort of product photography that has had this sort of effort and thought put into it, it winds up being either more visually pleasing, or it engages you for a little bit longer. And so it's really important to have some sort of you know, visual interest or some sort of cue to kind of grab your viewer's eye. So I'm pretty happy with the placement of my HDR. I might just rotate it ever so slightly a little bit more in the direction that I was going in. It hasn't done much, but I'll just leave it alone for now. I can always make more changes to it down the road. So I think one of the last things that I want to capture that is a part of my reference image, my reference images, kind of some of these I liked, was there is a little bit of depth of field. So this center bottle, the one that's the subject, kind of the hero, is in focus, and this one that's furthest in the background is a little bit out of focus. It's a little soft visually. So I think I'm going to try to work some depth of field into my scene now. And this is always a fun, and by fun I mean tricky, thing to implement into your scene. So I'm going to click filter, and I'm going to hide my lights and my environment and the grid, because I just want to clean up my viewport, and you'll see why. Because in the details tab of my camera, there are a couple checkboxes that are unchecked, and it's called DOF map front blur and DOF map rear blur, and the DOF stands for depth of field. So I'm going to enable both, or I'm going to enable the front one first and show you guys what is happening, because something has just happened. Something is now turned on. So if I check this on and off, it's super hard to see, but there is a little faint colored line with a new handle kind of present. And if I enable the rear one, there is another one that is past my objects. So what these are is, this is kind of the start and the end of your focal range, or your focus range in the quote-unquote lens that you're looking through. So in most cameras, you kind of have, I would say, anything or any sort of camera lens that has a relatively smaller aperture, you'll have some sort of focal plane that has room for objects in focus. And this is basically mimicking that, in that you have these little handles, and by pulling this front one closer to the camera, and by that you are moving it away from the objects, what you're saying is objects closer to the camera are more likely to be in focus, And if I move it in the opposite direction, this way, if I kind of push this, if I push the start of my depth of field like right up to my object, what it's saying is that anything that would be in this range would be super out of focus, if that makes sense. So if I kind of pull these right along my objects, so that the start one is very close to my front bottle, and my rear one is, oops, let me, it's important actually before you start moving those to move the center one. You want to move the center one to be where you want your focus to be. So in this case, I want the front of my front bottle to be in focus. So it's kind of tricky to get your cameras situated right. But I'm going to go in my top view, and I'm going to pull this dot. And if you kind of draw an imaginary line in your head along these dots, so this is kind of the center of my focus region. So I'm going to turn these back on. So if I move this back one kind of behind my back object, and this front one in front of my object, and then in my render settings, I know depth of field is in here somewhere. In here, or?
Are you looking for it in the render settings?
I know there's somewhere else I need to enable it, I believe. I don't know, let's just click render and see what happens. Right, so this has not enabled anything yet. So it's in here somewhere. There it is. You have to add an effect to depth of field. Of course.
And where is that in?
So in the so in the camera object, you've got the details tab. You need to enable these two checkboxes and then play around with the start and end. And once you play around with those start and end values, you have to go to your render settings and add an effect that's called depth of field. And we'll just leave this on default, and we'll see what this looks like now. If this works or not. This is my version of using the AB render, is by just clicking through these very fast, or arrow up and down. So this hasn't enabled, visually it hasn't turned on our depth of field. So let's just try a crazy high value and see if that, yes. So I know how to turn it on in the next render setting that I'm about to show you, which is not the standard render, it's the physical render. It's been a very long time since I've used the standard render. Probably, well, I haven't used it since they invented the physical render, which was an R13. So that was 5 versions of Cinema ago. So this is the old school way of doing depth of field. There we go. That's something.
Hello.
Yeah, so this is a super tilt-shifted, teeny tiny focal range.
Your objects.
Yes. There's no longer a background. None of that matters anymore. I have a bottle in focus. So we're actually going to pull that. We're going to pull this blur strength. This was 5, so let's try 20.
And you added the background blur.
Yes, so let's try 20 on this. Let's just try 20 on all of these. Because we want something tasteful and realistic, not something super crazy, over-exaggerated. That's right. That's why I wasn't seeing anything, because I believe the depth of field effect, when you add depth of field through this standard render, when you have to add it as an effect, it doesn't show until the render's finished, which is a super cool feature. If you've played around with glow, I know some other people in here have added glow to their scenes. The glow only shows up after the render as well.
Your table was blurry.
You said you added 20?
Yeah, so in this one I have 20 on the first 3 values. So this is looking a little bit better. If I had a nice like wood grain texture on this table, this would look pretty sweet, I think. It's definitely coming along from where it was up here. And this is why I like using the picture viewer to do my test renders, as opposed to just doing the Control R render.
Does it save some?
Yes. As long as my computer's on and I haven't shut it off, I'll be able to go through all these infinitely, because they get saved temporarily, and they go away when you turn your computer off or close Cinema. So this one's crazy. We're just gonna go between these. So this looks pretty good. This is blurring out the bit of my background, and it's leaving my bottles in focus. Although I kind of want this back one to start to fall away a little bit more.
And you said when you're setting that up, you do the 2 red, or there's 3 different like columns there.
Oh yeah, these 3 different values. There's blur strength, distance blur, and background blur.
No, I mean in the camera.
Oh, in the camera, in
Yeah,
the detail.
it's
Right. Okay. So the three focus points that I'm moving around.
Mhm.
So the center one is the actual like what's clear,
Right.
and that is under object, and it's the focus distance.
And so that should be like right.
Yeah. So this should be exactly where you want your focus to be. So in my case, I want my focus to be on the front of my front bottle. I would say most of you guys would probably fall into that category. So I used a couple different kind of camera angles. I used the top camera and kind of going off to the side here. So I lined up my focus distance. So this is what's going to be clear and sharp. I lined this up to the front of my front bottle. And then in the details tab, for the depth of field front blur, I'm going to pull this actually a little bit away from the object. So it was very close to the front bottle. I'm going to pull it away, and I'm going to pull this back one kind of over this back bottle a little bit, because I kind of want this back bottle to fall out of focus a little bit more than it is. So let's see what these changes do. Oops. Let's see what these little adjustments to our front and rear blurs do. And so most of you guys, just to go back over on the output, I still have my width and height as 8 by 10 inches. And the resolution, or the DPI, for the final it should be 300. But just for like testing purposes, so that these test renders go faster, I lowered this resolution down from 300 to 50, or just whatever number. If you've got like a laptop at home, you might want to maybe make this even a little bit smaller, just so that the renders are a little bit more manageable. Because right now, it looks like my renders are one of these numbers. And my time per frame is about 30 seconds per frame, which isn't super great. So the smaller I make that resolution, this is kind of the less pixels I'm rendering, you know, and so the less pixels you're rendering, the faster it'll go. So in this case, the effective size of what I'm rendering is only 400 pixels by 500 pixels, which is pretty manageable. It actually kind of fits well on this monitor here at the school. So I think this is. So this didn't seem to do much, changing these front and back blurs. I'm not really seeing anything to the very top. I'm seeing a little bit on the reflections and stuff. So I'm going to pull this kind of one step further. And possibly try to raise my distance blur and see what this looks like. And if I don't get it here, then I'll kind of just give up and move on. But these subtle little nitpicks and this attention to detail is really what I'll be kind of looking for in this assignment. You know, really trying to nail the look of your glass and creating some sort of interesting setup with your scene. Kind of how everything is placed is gonna really be the bread and butter of this assignment. And so again, it's still really not doing much to my back, so I'm gonna move on, I think. So in my reference images, most of these kind of craft beer things are on like wood. Seems to be a common thing is lots of wood and kind of vintage looking furniture and stuff. So I'm going to make my box, my crate here that we have our scene posed on, I'm going to make this into wood. So I'm going to jump onto Google, and I should be on textures.com, but I'm not. So I'm going to look up some sort of wood. This looks kind of cool. This feels appropriate. So open that up in a new tab as a possibility. Some kind of rough wood. This looks pretty cool. Here we go. I think I like this one the most out of what I looked at so far. Although this one has a lot of character, as they'd call it. I think I'm going to go with this one. So I'm going to save this and save it to my folder. And this will probably be the last thing that I do. So I'm going to open up back in Photoshop. I'm going to open up my image, wood grain base. And I'm going to show you guys how to make a couple different layers for a wood grain texture out of just one base image. Now this is by no means like a scientific kind of approach, but I think it's going to look pretty good pretty quickly, and it doesn't require anything that you guys probably don't know already in Photoshop. So I'm just going to name this one color, and then I'm going to duplicate it. So for my first one, I'm going to make specular. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this layer and so specular and bump maps and stuff, those are grayscale versions of image textures. What I mean by that is they're white and black. So I'm just going to add, I could just do white and black, but I'm going to add a hue and saturation. I'm going to pull the saturation down and just clip this. I'm going to do levels, clip that as well. And on this levels one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of crush the top end and bottom end of this image. And of course, preferences. Where are preferences? And of course, overscroll is off. So overscroll is nice because now I can actually see my image and have this panel up. So the specular channel is going to affect reflections and the way that the light is hitting the image. And so in that, areas that are white are going to be reflective or more reflective, and areas that are black are going to be less reflective. So I'm going to pick something kind of in the middle, a little bit kind of erring on the lighter side, because most metal has some, or I mean most wood has some sort of like sheen or maybe like a polish or a stain to it. So that looks pretty good, I think, for my first attempt. And then I'm just going to duplicate these again, and I'm going to call this one bump. And on the bump one, what I want to do is, instead of changing this to the lighter side, I'm going to try to change it to a little bit on the darker end, because this would be a rather like rough, kind of gritty, almost kind of unpleasant wood to touch. It would be, you definitely wouldn't want to rub your fingers along, at least the way that I'm kind of envisioning I want my scene to look. So on a bump map, black is a little bit bumpier. So this looks pretty good. So now I'm just going to save these, save as. So I'm going to call this wood grain bump. And I'm just saving these as TIFFs. Oops, I'm going to discard, actually I'm going to discard the layers. So that's the bump one, and then I'm going to save it again. Wood grain specular. Turn off the layers. And then I've already got the color one because that's just the JPEG right off the internet. Just the wood grain base. So on my box crate, I make a wood crate. So just real quick, I'm going to plug all these different textures in. Load image. So I'm going to load the wood grain base into the color channel, and then in reflectance, I'm going to add a Beckman layer, and then in the reflection strength of this Beckman layer is where I will load my specular. Probably pull that down because I don't want it to be too bright kind of looking. Wait, no, I'm going to pull this one down. Yeah, that's it. And then in bump, I will plug in my bump. And I'm going to make this value negative because I want my bump to kind of bump inwards. And we'll just see what this looks like just with like a cubic mapping. Nothing too fancy, because at least with the way that I've got my camera positioned, and I did this kind of on purpose, this wasn't a happy accident, I'm not seeing any other side than the top. So I don't need to like try to UV map my object to make it look like these wood panels are like kind of, you know, actual panels with like thickness and stuff. I can just do the top and kind of be done with it. So we'll just render this once, see what this looks like. I might have to kind of tweak the strength of like the specular or the bump and stuff, and I'll probably do that as I'm just kind of tinkering around up here. But once this render finishes, this will probably be the end of the lecture, so we covered a lot. So with basically just taking one flat image off of Google, I made a pretty cool looking wood texture, and it's pretty subtle, but you can see a small reflection, at least of the cans. You probably can't see this up on the projector, but kind of right along in there, there's a line that I'm seeing, and that's a reflection, and then I'm seeing some of the white reflection of the can. So I think I'm pretty happy with this wood, and with 2 minutes of Photoshop work and one Google image, I kind of came out with a pretty decent looking wood. So I think that'll be it for the lecture.